In this study, we are looking at the malt varieties AAC Prairie and Churchill versus the feed variety CDC Durango and AB Wrangler. We're comparing these varieties under standard and enhanced rates of nitrogen, with and without plant growth regulator, and with and without fungicide. These varieties are very new and are anticipated to become popular in the future. If they do indeed become popular, we will hopefully have data to advise farmers when they are currently growing these varieties and not after they've moved on to other varieties. Well, let's see how the results check out. The Agriarm sites involved in the study for 2024 and 2025 are located at Indian Head, Melfort, Scott, Swift Current, and we here in Yorkton are leading the study. This work was developed by Mitchell Japp and supported financially by Sask Barley. The trials were a split plot design. The main plot factor compares 4 levels of management that vary the amount of nitrogen with and without the use of plant growth regulator and fungicide. The 2 levels of nitrogen compared are referred to as either standard or enhanced. These rates varied somewhat between locations based on their historical yield potential. For example, the standard and enhanced rates of soil plus fertilizer nitrogen at Swift Current were 100 versus 125 pounds per acre. In contrast, rates of 130 and 162 pounds of nitrogen per acre were compared at Yorkton and Melfort, where yield potential is higher in the black soil zone. The fungicide used was Trivapro, and the plant growth regulator was Modus. To determine the impact of plant growth regulator, we are comparing management C versus A. This means impact of PGR is being determined at the standard rate of nitrogen and with fungicide. Likewise, the impact of enhancing nitrogen, management B versus A, is being determined with fungicide, but not with PGR. The impact of fungicide is being determined at the standard rate of nitrogen without PGR. And finally, the impact of fungicide plus plant growth regulator is being determined at the standard rate of nitrogen. The study was designed this way to provide as much information as possible for the least amount of cost. As I said in the introduction, these are the varieties tested at each level of management. AAC Prairie and CDC Churchill are malt varieties, and CDC Durango and AB Wrangler are the feed varieties. So we have 4 levels of management by 4 varieties, which gives us a total of 16 treatments. Let's start with looking at the impact of plant growth regulator on barley. Here we have the average crop height with and without PGR at each location in 2024. You can see PGR in blue significantly reduced the height of barley at all sites. No interactions with varieties were detected, meaning the impact of PGR on crop height did not differ between varieties. In 2025, the application of PGR significantly reduced plant height for all locations except Scott and Swift Current, which were drought stressed. Again, all varieties were shortened by PGR to a similar degree. This figure shows the level of lodging with and without PGR at each location in 2024. 0 means no lodging and 9 is flat to the ground. PGR in blue significantly reduced lodging at all sites, but Swift Current, which was droughted. However, there were interactions at Yorkton, Melfort, and Indian Head. This means the impact of PGR on lodging differed between varieties, which we'll examine in a moment. In 2025, applying PGR only significantly reduced lodging at Melfort. However, there were a couple of interactions here that also need to be explored. Okay, let's look at those interactions. Here we have the effects of lodging for each variety at Scott in 2025. Please note that beside each variety is an indication of the variety's resistance to lodging. Varieties are classified as either having fair, good, or very good resistance to lodging. While the application of PGR in blue numerically reduced lodging for most varieties, lodging for AB Wrangler significantly increased. An explanation for this is definitely unclear. At Indian Head in 2024, PGR only significantly reduced lodging levels for Churchill and Wrangler. While reduced effects of PGR on CDC Durango might be expected due to its very good resistance to lodging, it's unusual that lodging was not significantly reduced for AAC Prairie with only a fair resistance rating to lodging. At Melfort in 2024, lodging was significantly reduced by PGR for all varieties except CDC Durango, which didn't lodge with or without PGR. At Melfort in 2025, PGR significantly reduced lodging the most for AB Wrangler, which only has fair resistance to lodging. Lodging was also significantly reduced for AAC Prairie and CDC Churchill, but to a lesser extent. Again, PGR had no effect on CDC Durango, it just doesn't want to lodge. At Yorkton in 2024, PGR greatly reduced lodging for AAC Prairie and CDC Churchill, and had more modest effect on CDC Durango. Again, very good resistance for Durango was expected, but Wrangler seems to be resisting lodging better than anticipated at this site year. Here is an aerial picture of our Yorkton site in 2024, which shows you how well the application of PGR within the black boxes managed to keep the crop standing. Let me give you a view of the plots from the ground level.
However, this year I'm hoping to see a yield benefit from plant growth regulator, as varieties sprayed with Modus over here are standing much better than those that were not sprayed with a plant growth regulator.
So, how well did the yield respond to PGR? Yorkton was the only site year where yield was significantly increased by PGR. Overall, yield increased by 11.4% or 12.6 bushels per acre. While a significant interaction wasn't detected, numerically CDC Durango and AB Wrangler, which lodged the least, also benefited the least in terms of yield from applied PGR. It was a pleasure to see a positive yield response to PGR, as the last time this occurred on our research farm was 10 years ago, with wheat. Most of the yield responses in between those times were negative due to dry conditions. There's just no point making the crop shorter during drought. Case in point can be seen the following year at Swift Current during drought. Swift Current was the only site in 2025 that was affected by PGR, and the effect was negative. Yield was significantly reduced by PGR, but there was an interaction. The yield reduction was only significant for AAC Prairie and CDC Churchill. A reason for the difference was unclear. However, I should point out that Swift Current 2025 was an unusual site with unusual results. The year started out dry, then precipitation was received in late summer. The resulting secondary growth ended up providing the majority of the yield as the primary growth was shelling. While not statistically significant, the use of PGR at Yorkton reduced grain yield by 0.94 percentage points through dilution, as yield was substantially increased by PGR at this location. Effects at other locations were non-significant and minimal. PGR significantly increased protein at Melfort in 2025. The reason for this is unclear, as PGR did not appear to reduce yield at this location. While all other sites were unaffected by the main effect of PGR, there was an interaction with variety at Yorkton. At Yorkton in 2025, PGR significantly increased grain protein, but only for CDC Churchill and CDC Durango. While not statistically significant, corresponding yield reductions for these varieties were observed, which would explain the rise in protein. So in the absence of lodging, PGR looks to be a little hard on the crop at times, reducing yield and increasing protein. I won't go into the data, but PGR was also decreasing test weight, kernel plumpness, and 1000 kernel weight as well. Switching gears now to look at the impact of fungicide. The application of fungicide did not significantly reduce the level of leaf disease at any location. The prevalence of leaf disease was fairly low in this study. However, there was a strong trend with a p-value of 0.06 for reduced leaf disease when spraying fungicide in blue at Yorkton. This translated into a significant yield response to fungicide of 14.8% or 14 bushels per acre at Yorkton. Melfort also had a significant, albeit small, response to fungicide, despite very low ratings for disease. No interactions with variety were detected, so the effect of fungicide did not differ between varieties. Fungicide resulted in a numerical decline in protein at Yorkton, which would be related to dilution from the yield increase. Protein was virtually identical with or without fungicide at all other sites. In 2025, fungicide still didn't significantly reduce leaf disease, but once again a large numerical decline was observed in Yorkton. Surprisingly, the relatively large decline in leaf disease at Yorkton in 2025 did not translate into a detectable yield increase. In fact, the application of fungicide did not increase yield at any location. However, a significant interaction at Swift Current found the yield of AAC Prairie and CDC Churchill were significantly increased with applied fungicide, but the feed varieties were unaffected. The reason for the differences is unclear, particularly since there was little leaf disease. However, the fungicide used was Trivipro, and Syngenta does claim improved water use efficiency under dry conditions. The crop at Swift Current developed under unusual circumstances, so these effects may be just the result of high variability. The CV was 23. Application of fungicide did not affect grain protein at any location in 2025, not even Swift Current, where fungicide had increased yield of AAC Prairie and CDC Churchill, which is strange, but again, Swift Current had issues. Now let's look at the impact of combining fungicide and PGR in the same year. Just to be clear, they were still sprayed at different times. The combination of fungicide and PGR in 2024 significantly and substantially increased yield for Yorkton by 28% or 27 bushels per acre. This is congruent with higher levels of lodging and leaf disease associated with this site year. It also shows the effects of PGR and fungicide were additive at this site. As covered earlier, PGR alone increased yield by 11.4%, fungicide alone increased yield by 14.8%, and together we see a yield increase of 28%. However, significant increases were not detected at any other location, including Melfort, where a 4% yield increase from fungicide was observed. The yield benefit at Melfort from fungicide may have been negated by the detrimental effects of the PGR. No yield increases from applying PGR and fungicide were observed at any location in 2025, including Swift Current, where the benefits of fungicide were observed. Again, detrimental effects of PGR may have erased the benefits of fungicide. The combination of fungicide and PGR also significantly and substantially decreased grain protein at Yorkton by 1.9 percentage points. Not surprising, as the yield was increased by 28%. The decrease in grain protein would have increased the likelihood of selection for the malt barley varieties. Surprisingly, PGR plus fungicide significantly increased grain protein at Indian Head and Melfort. However, the difference was extremely small at Melfort. No effects were detected at Scott and Swift Current. At Melfort and Indian Head, there was no evidence to suggest PGR alone or in combination with fungicide decreased yield, so I'm not sure why grain protein would have increased at these locations. In 2025, application of fungicide plus PGR significantly increased grain protein at Yorkton, but there was an interaction indicating that the effect differed between varieties. The increase in protein was greatest for CDC Churchill, which can largely be attributed to PGR, which also numerically reduced yield and significantly increased grain protein of CDC Churchill when applied alone. Reducing yield potential is well known to increase grain protein, and PGRs are known to reduce the yield potential of cereals when applied during a dry season. That is not a recommended practice. And this was certainly the case for Yorkton in 2025. While not statistically significant, the application of fungicide also numerically reduced yield potential and increased grain protein. The reason for this occurrence is not clear. Switching now to the effects of enhancing nitrogen rate. Enhancing N rate did not significantly increase yield at any location in 2024, except Melfort, where the yield was significantly increased by 3.3%. In 2025, enhancing N rate increased yield at Yorkton by 22% and significantly decreased yield at Swift Current. Excepting Swift Current in 2025, there were no interactions with variety indicating that the effect of enhancing N differed between varieties. However, significant yield reductions at Swift Current from enhancing rates of nitrogen only occurred for the malt varieties, AAC Prairie and CDC Churchill. A reason for a decline in yield, specifically for malt varieties, is unclear. However, as stated earlier, this is an unusual site where the second growth constituted most of the yield. Increasing nitrogen may have reduced yield potential by delaying maturity. Who knows? In 2024, enhancing N rate at all sites except Swift Current significantly increased grain protein as expected. Grain protein at Swift Current was extremely high at 20%, and I would imagine the protein was unresponsive to enhancing N because it had plateaued. In 2025, enhancing N rate significantly increased grain protein at all locations except Swift Current and Yorkton. Conclusions. PGR effectively reduced height of all varieties and frequently reduced lodging. However, lodging was never reduced for CDC Durango as it had low lodging with or without PGR. Yorkton 2024 was the only site where yield was increased by PGR, and the increase of 11.4% had a corresponding drop in grain protein of 0.94% through yield dilution. If plants were drought stressed, the application of PGR tended to reduce yield, test weight, kernel plumpness, and thousand kernel weight. Disease levels were low in this study, and while fungicide never significantly reduced leaf disease, some sizable numeric reductions were observed. Fungicide significantly increased yield at Yorkton and Melfort in 2024, and for the malt barley varieties at Swift Current in 2025. At Melfort and Swift Current, the yield increases may have been the result of a plant health benefit as opposed to reductions in leaf disease. The positive effects of fungicide and PGR at Yorkton in 2024 were additive, where yield increased by 28% and grain protein decreased by 1.9 percentage points. In some cases, the detrimental effects of PGR may have negated the yield benefits from fungicide. Reductions in test weight, kernel plumpness, and thousand kernel weight were likely the result of the PGR portion of the combination. Enhancing nitrogen rate increased yield in a couple of site years and increased grain protein in many site years. While yield and grain protein response didn't usually differ between varieties, nitrogen still needs to be managed based on different risk tolerances for excessive protein between malt and feed. Overall, Durango was 4.6% higher yielding than the other varieties, and grain protein was higher for AAC Prairie and AB Wrangler compared to CDC Churchill and CDC Durango. If you made it this far with me, I appreciate it. I know, this study was a big one.